Hello, class. I'm Cynthia Biller, and my lecture is entitled Escalating Tensions, Distrust, and Alarm. And this is for a graduate level U.S. history course on the political and ideological origins of the Cold War. So, this lecture, we're going to discuss how the tensions continue to rise, mostly in 1946. We're going to focus on this week. So up until this point in the course, we've already covered the ideological developments within Russia in the second half of the 1800s with Russian nihilism, the influence of Nietzsche, the influence of Darwin, and how those philosophies impacted the culture and the intelligentsia of Russia, and how that really set the stage for the Russian Revolution in 1917. We've also explored the history of wars within Russia, which also contributed to unrest, the loss of the war with Japan in 1905, the tremendous losses in World War I that led to the forced abdication by Tsar Nicholas I. And then, of course, the Russian Revolution in 1917, which brought Lenin to power. We had the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1922 to really determine whether or not the communist power under Lenin would hold, and it did, sadly, for the people. We've also explored Lenin's thought and Stalin's thought, and some of their incredibly brutal policies. We also have covered World War II, which is a really important element in considering the way that the stage was set as we enter 1946, as the former allies and their leaders in particular sought to determine what would be best after the defeat of Hitler in World War II. We've explored the general outline of World War II, the incredible losses which Russia experienced, or the many millions of soldiers which were killed as well as civilians during World War II, really as the two tyrants, the two totalitarian tyrants confronted each other and would not allow their soldiers to retreat. And you had the civilians caught in the middle. So between Stalin and Hitler, incredible number of casualties there on the Eastern Front in World War II. And it's important to remember that as we're considering the mental space that the Russians were working out of, as well as the Western powers. We had the United Kingdom nearly collapsing after the fall of France and the Nazis taking over the continent and then setting their sights on Britain and what they had come through to survive, really, that existential threat. Also with the United States, the incredible impact of war production there and involvement again in an international conflict on the other side of the world, but as well the conflict with the Japanese after Pearl Harbor and the war in the Pacific. So we had a very war-weary world at this point. In 1945, of course, there were some really important developments as the war wound down and the Allied leaders met to decide the future fate of the world, really. So we've already discussed the Yalta Conference with Stalin and FDR and Churchill, and how each of them had different priorities of what they were seeking to achieve as the war came to its conclusion, and how shortly after that, Stalin completely disregarded his promises regarding free elections in Poland, and how that contributed to distrust then among the Allied leaders, or the Western power leaders, of Stalin and his willingness to keep his word when he agreed to something. We also then had victory in Europe, and then the Potsdam Conference, at which time that's also an interesting backdrop for 1946, because we had an interesting changing of the powers, the leaders within the Western powers, where it had been FDR and Churchill. FDR had died in the spring of 1945, and so you suddenly we found Harry Truman suddenly thrust onto the world stage without a lot of international political experience. And then during the Potsdam Conference, as we've covered, Winston Churchill lost his re-election, so he lost the role as prime minister. So suddenly the dynamics had changed recently quite dramatically, where it really was now Truman and Stalin that were the two superpower leaders that were most were at the forefront of what the events and decisions that were being made as events moved into 1946. So all of that provides the backdrop, which is really important to remember and consider as we look at the events of 1946. So this week we're going to be reading Stalin's speech, where he specifically stated that capitalism brings war, and that specifically capitalism had been the cause of both World War I and World War II. And this was seen as extremely inflammatory in the West. And that was in February of 1946. You all will be reading that this week. We also will be reading George Kennan's long telegram. Kennan was a diplomat in Russia, and he had been asked to assess the overall political situation in Russia, and he wrote what came to be the very famous long telegram, in which he laid out the realities which he saw within Russia, being that Stalin and his regime only respected power, that basically containment was the best strategy, and that they would take advantage of weakness, and that it was that they had grand designs of expansion, of really an aggressive expansion of communism throughout the world, wherever possible, and the undermining of the Western powers wherever possible as well. So that's George Kennan's long telegram, which was also in February of 1946. And then you'll also be reading Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. You may already have read this or be familiar with this, but even though he wasn't prime minister, he was still a very influential figure. And he traveled to the United States and gave a speech in Missouri, where he first publicly called you can use the term Iron Curtain to express that dividing line between Eastern and Western Europe, and to really call attention to the danger of communism, and to begin to delineate more clearly the differences in fundamental ideology and methodology which the communists and the Western powers were willing to use to implement and achieve their goals. So that will be another interesting read for you this week. We will also be covering Stalin's reply to Churchill's speech. And then, it's interesting in history. It's often, we know what happens at the end. So it's easy to judge history from a very comfortable place of certainty that nuclear war never did happen between the Soviets and the United States, or out of the certainty of the policy of containment that was adopted. But this is a really interesting point this week to consider. It's really one of the conflicts in this time in history was, how should we respond to this Russian aggression? And there were conflicting opinions about that. We already talked about George Kennan's perspective on that. But Henry Wallace gave a very different perspective in a speech that he gave in September of 1946, where he instead really wanted more economic cooperation and wanted to treat the Russians continue to treat them more as allies. He claimed this wasn't appeasement, so it's a little bit unclear exactly what that meant, but he really was intentionally calling for a different policy than Kennan's, and what Truman actually adopted, which became the Truman Doctrine and the containment strategy. And much of that was reinforced by the failure of appeasement with Hitler, and desire to make sure that what had been experienced with Hitler did not happen again with Stalin. So you did have this conflict of opinions, and Henry Wallace had actually been the vice president under FDR from 41 to 45 before Truman became vice president and then obviously president. So that's interesting to consider as you're reading the materials this week, that conflict of opinions, and really allow yourself to wrestle with that and think about that as you're reading the different materials this week. So I really hope that these materials that we're going over helps to deepen your understanding of the origins of the Cold War and the unique situation that these leaders found themselves in, and the difficult challenge of weighing what the best response to this totalitarian aggression during this time was. So thanks so much. I hope you all have a great week.